y'all, this is Rodrigo Arancibia from the High Tech High Graduate School of Education, and I'm here to talk to you about EdSpace, a social learning network. Well, what is EdSpace? EdSpace is a place for you to connect and get curious with the people that you want to connect with. But what EdSpace isn't is a popularity contest like Twitter. It's not a place for you to sit and listen and sit and get like YouTube. EdSpace TV is a personal channel for you to do your own vlogging to tell your story about your experiences. Not comfortable with video yet? It's all good. Every single channel is going to have post-it boards. Write your question down on the post-it board and someone will respond to you with a video post. Social media networks are noisy. That's why we created EdSpace filters. On every single channel, you'll be able to drill down on which educators you want to learn from and which educators you want to get curious with. Whether you're a second grade teacher in Arkansas or a project-based learning teacher in San Diego, use the EdSpace filters to find your people and get curious with them. EdSpace has two types of channels: public channels that everybody can view and everybody can access, and private channels that only teachers from your school can see. Cool thing is, you can also see which teachers from your school site are signed up for EdSpace. So what's next? Introduce yourself. Pin a video to your personal channel and tell us what you're curious about. Tell us what you're working on. Tell us what you're passionate about. The most important thing is that you get started. Show up and share more.
We have with us for this next session here at Inspired Are You Future Ready? Day 1, The Future of Schools, Dr. Michael Crawford. Michael is co-founder of EdSpace, which is of course our Inspired community app. He also holds a PhD in educational psychology. Today, Michael will be having a discussion with us on exploring education's promise, technology, and our collective intelligence. We dive into several fields, namely education technology and its relevance, especially in this VUCA future, as well as the concept of collective intelligence and how the COVID pandemic has proven that not just in healthcare, but in education in various fields beyond, that there is a need to overcome the working in silos and to collaborate and partner even more than we have ever before. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us for this session. Michael Crawford is, of course, the co-founder of EdSpace, which is also our Inspired community app. So feel free to download the app and use it for your Q&As, for your reflections, networking, and general discussion if you have not done so. But in the meantime, Michael will be joining us for this conversation, where the topic will be surrounding exploring education's promise, technology and our collective intelligence. We'll be looking a bit into EdTech and also looking into the concept of collective intelligence, the need for collaboration and partnerships in this realm of education. So if I may begin by quoting luminary George Bernard Shaw, "If you have an apple and I have an apple and we exchange these apples, we end up with one apple each. But if you have an idea and I have an idea and we exchange these ideas, then we end up with two ideas each, or perhaps even more." So as we have seen from the COVID-19 pandemic, the world has offered a collective response. Many countries have worked together in fields of healthcare. This whole search for a vaccine, it clearly demonstrates the need for collective intelligence. And that is in the field of healthcare, but we are on the field of education. So Michael, perhaps if you could begin by giving a brief elaboration on collective intelligence, what it represents in education, in EdTech, maybe a summary of what you believe to be the key benefits, as well as how you view the current state of collective intelligence in these fields.
Absolutely, and thanks, Nigel, for having me, for hosting this conference, and for partnering with EdSpace to support this conference overall. So collective intelligence, I think, as you mentioned, is more important now than maybe it ever has. And not only is it more important now, but I think we are much closer to being capable of leveraging what it offers. So when we think about collective intelligence, generally it is collaboration across a wide scale. It's focusing on the ways in which different groups of people are able to bring their expertise and their insights and not just kind of throw them into the mix. It's not just a sum of individual expertise or individual skills, but instead it is greater than the sum of the parts. It is something unique that emerges from that kind of collaboration. And so I think in education, there's slices of this happening in different places. There are formal organizations or departments that are focusing on collective intelligence. So at MIT, for example, they have a lab. One part of their MIT lab is the media lab is dedicated to collective intelligence and really trying to explore this. And so we see it in some examples in higher ed. But beyond that, in the education space, there are ever growing numbers of ed tech companies. There are new schools, charter schools, new programs that are aiming to support young people and adults in the higher ed case and post-secondary. And so we're beginning to see through different social media platforms, different networks, different communities that are coming together, this potential, I would argue, for collective intelligence to emerge in the education space. I think at this point, we haven't seen it in a big way yet. I think we're still seeing individual institutions, be they companies or universities or school systems or school networks, that are primarily focused on what is in front of them, focusing on what they're doing, and haven't necessarily figured out how to come together as one yet. But I think with the technology that is emerging, with the different groups recognizing the importance of collaborating in that kind of way, I think we'll begin to see more and more movement in the direction of collective intelligence being valuable for education. Now, I think in terms of benefits, a handful come to mind. One around this ability to solve larger problems. So outside of education, we think of poverty or climate change or food insecurity. These are incredibly large issues that affect millions or billions of people, and the existing solutions, these sort of smaller, narrower solutions, are less likely to address these massive problems that we have. So one benefit of collective intelligence, of this coming together of multiple stakeholders and adding their expertise in unique ways, is the fact that we can now begin to address bigger problems in a more realistic and potentially find a solution. I think then the second piece is the problems that I mentioned, things like climate change and poverty and education in particular. These are complex problems. These are not, there's a difference between complicated and complex. Building a rocket ship is complicated. A lot of different parts, a lot of buttons, a lot of wires, all kinds of things are happening, but it's described as a complicated problem. Complex problems are ones where one input does not necessarily predict one output. It's not an A to B kind of prediction. And so when we have complex problems, we need to be able to address those problems with sort of complex tools. And collective intelligence is one of those tools that allows for the adaptability. It allows for the incorporation of context. And so again, collective intelligence can help in that way. And then the third potential benefit is this ability to discover or find hybrid solutions. So, when you have sort of a simple problem, you can apply a simple answer. When you have another simple problem, you apply a simple solution. What collective intelligence allows for is sort of the emerging. There's solutions in the middle of these, sort of this blending of different ways of seeing problems and of seeing solutions. And I think collective intelligence allows for that. And so, just to kind of bring it back, in the education space, I think we're seeing the emergence of institutions, the emergence of technology, some of the will that will be necessary to bring currently disparate and disconnected groups together. We're beginning to see that. I wouldn't say that sort of collective intelligence is active at the moment yet.
Thank you, Michael. You mentioned the need to solve these bigger world problems. And I think we see industry doing a lot of that. And when I say industry, I'm segregating it away from education. Of course, these two do go hand in hand. We see that particularly in higher education, where sometimes curricula is driven by industry partners. And this is increasingly also happening in K-12 education. We have schools that are partnering with, for example, the likes of Google, the likes of Tesla, and so on. So, given these increasing partnerships and the fact that people are predicting as well due to the pandemic, we'll end up with maybe Harvard, Google University, or things like MIT, Apple University. What are your thoughts on this concept? I mean, is it collective intelligence? Is it to a certain extent meddling as well, given that education has to kind of adhere to the industry's needs?
Right. I have mixed feelings about this. I think on the positive side, certainly the Apples and the Googles and the Amazons and some of these larger corporations, international corporations, and in these cases technology corporations, have within them incredible capacity to innovate, to derive solutions, and to really push humanity in new directions. I think that's incredibly powerful. They obviously have huge reach. They're worldwide. They have a ton of resources in terms of people and dollars and influence. And so they're in great positions to make a positive impact in the world generally, but in education specifically. So I think on that front, it is positive. On the opposite side, I think I have concerns about the over partnering of some of these larger universities and some of these larger corporations. I think about data and data privacy and the concerns that people have already about the Googles and Apples and Amazons, having access to so much data that their ability to know us exceeds our ability to know ourselves. It's something Yuval Noah Harari talks about a bunch, and talking about the future will be in who controls the data and what they're able to do with it. And so I have concerns about large corporations that are working with universities that employ thousands of people, that support young people, thousands of students, and then where do those people go moving forward, and just their connection to data. It's something I think about a bunch. The other thing is, I think with the rise of some of these larger companies, I have concerns about sort of the corporatization of universities. Now, certainly universities have, for a long time, especially private universities, have had to have a more business mindset approach to their work than public universities, perhaps. They have to think about fundraising in different ways. They have to think about where they place their dollars and what they invest in. And so private universities are they're private. They have different needs and they serve different goals. And so the partnering with such a large corporation like a Google or an Apple feels like there's essentially no turning back. When Harvard or Stanford or MIT, who is already a private institution, who already doesn't need to sort of deal with the public or public good in certain ways, then partners with such a large institution like a Google or Apple, it makes me think that we are just that much closer to the corporate technology overlords taking over everything. So it brings me a little bit of concern. And then the last piece I'll say is sort of connected to that, which is universities, for all of their faults and for many of the things that they get criticized for in terms of tuition and maybe even college athletics as sort of being a distraction. Most universities and colleges are public, or many are at least, and they are intending to serve, according to them, and I think it is true, the public good. And so this idea of the public good, we can almost begin to think of as sort of what collective intelligence can yield in a public space, in sort of the public sector. It's individual citizens their needs, their contributions, and that can sort of be described as the public good. And so if public universities, colleges are serving this public good, what is it that private universities that are partnered with massive international corporations, what are they serving? What are their goals? What are their intentions? And so it's sort of the third piece that kind of gives me a little bit of pause. But we have seen partnerships beginning to happen in this way, not necessarily at that size, but many institutions, many colleges and universities partner with all kinds of organizations. I would imagine Google and Apple have partnerships with a lot of universities across the country, probably across the world. And so it isn't that they shouldn't have these partnerships. I think there are benefits, but if Harvard were to rename itself or to partner in such a way that it's now Apple Harvard, I think I would be worried.
Michael, you mentioned the need to serve the public good a lot in your response, and you also mentioned these organizations that large organizations with massive reach, whether it's in terms of financial capabilities, whether it's in terms of reaching out to a global population. And we are seeing an increasing number of not just these large organizations, but people in business who are branching out into the education realm, setting up schools, starting startup companies, innovating in edtech. And sometimes we wonder, whether they are in the education business or whether they're in the business of education. And this leads me to my next question, which is, is there room for edtech where you have all these different companies claiming to innovate, but essentially sort of doing the same thing, trying to reinvent the wheel? Same thing as well for schools. I mean, we see an increase in the number of private and international schools. I think in the States you call them charter schools, where again they claim to innovate. They may have a different program that they run in addition to their day-to-day syllabus. What are your thoughts on these schools and these startups?
Yeah, again, this is a challenging one for me. With my kind of entrepreneurial hat on, or my innovation-minded hat, I very much appreciate the ability or the opportunity for things like charter schools to emerge, to have different takes on what it means to support young people, or perhaps a particular purpose that they're really aiming for, that then students and families have the ability to choose to say, hey, I want my young person to focus on learning a second language, an immersive language charter school, for example, or a charter school that's focused on social activism or computer science. That as a concept, I think, makes a ton of sense to me. We as consumers, as citizens, as people, appreciate the ability to pursue the things that we're interested in. We all have different needs and not necessarily needs, but we all have different interests. We all have different passions. And so if there were a school that was better aligned to the things that my kid was interested in, it would make a ton of sense for me to want to put my kid in that environment. And so I totally get that. On the other hand, there are concerns that have been well documented and well researched that, in fact, these charter schools don't deliver on many of the metrics that we currently apply to schools. They don't deliver any different than public schools. And in fact, their governance structures are much less transparent. They have, these sort of corporate, called charter management organizations here, CMOs in the US, where it's not completely clear what their mission is or what their goal is. Are they there to make money off of students attending their school, or are they there to provide an innovative educational opportunity? It's not as clear. And getting back to the sort of public good and the concept of supporting the public in that way, K-12 schools can do that. In the US at least, K-12 schools are funded primarily by taxpayer dollars, which means that every citizen who pays taxes in this country is contributing to the education, enrichment, nourishment of young people to serve and build the country moving forward. And so when some of those dollars that all of us are paying into in the US are diverted to an organization that doesn't have as clear of vision or metrics or governance, I think it's potentially problematic. And so get to tie in part of your question around folks from outside of education now being part of education, I think it's tricky. I am not a licensed K-12 teacher. My wife was a former teacher. My parents are retired public school educators. I am very familiar with what it is to be a teacher, even though I haven't been a K-12 one. I've taught at higher ed, but not in K-12. And yet I am working in the education space, and in particular the K-12 education space with EdSpace. And so do I think I shouldn't be able to add my value and expertise and insights and wisdom to this space because I'm not a licensed K-12 teacher? No, I don't think that. At the same time, there are, it is incredibly important for us and for anybody who's doing work that is serving other folks, that are serving customers, or that are serving users or serving students or teachers, to really understand as best we can from their perspective, from their experience. And so would it be better if teachers were involved in the leadership level at their school? Absolutely. Would it be better if students and teachers had a say of the kinds of things that happen within their district? Definitely. At the higher levels, at state levels and at the federal levels, is it important for teachers to have their voices heard and taken seriously at all these levels? Absolutely. In this country right now, we have a Secretary of Education who never attended any public schools, didn't have her kids attend public schools, have never taught in any kind of capacity, and yet she's responsible for driving policy at the federal level. And so sort of people rightly critique and criticize and are concerned about that. And so I think that is true even as we kind of move towards the ground. That you don't have to be a licensed K-12 teacher, but you need to go out of your way, if that's the case, to learn from them, to listen to them, to really try to understand what they're working with, because ultimately what you're trying to create is the kind of environment for teachers to be able to do their work as best they can, because that work is what allows young people to thrive. And so having the best understanding of their experiences, I think, paramount.
Great. You've mentioned a lot about schools and how it's a fine line between how they should operate versus how people from outside of the education realm may come in with new innovative ideas and change our existing perceptions in a positive way. Mm-hmm. If I may now shift the conversation to EdTech, and if we look at especially throughout this pandemic period, a lot of conversation has been had with regards to the need for EdTech to go beyond just things that can be done online. We have vast populations in developing nations and sometimes even in developed nations that may not have access to the necessary infrastructure. So be it internet access, be it mobile devices, laptops, and so on, to be able to use these innovations. The discussion that has been had around this, everyone's been saying there needs to be collaboration, there needs to be collective intelligence in terms of coming up with solutions. But at the same time, if we look at a lot of the solutions out there that actually cater to presence learning, so without the need for internet access and so on, there's already a lot of stuff out there. So are we actually wearing a blindfold and being oblivious to a lot of these positive inputs that we can already use, rather than just maybe continuing to harp on about the lack of infrastructure?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think the the effect of what we're doing seems like we have a blindfold on. I think there may be some people who are, on purpose, intentionally, kind of focusing on what they're focusing on and are not at all concerned about actual examples where good and necessary positive things are happening. I think that is probably true. I also think that, especially in education, maybe less so in ed tech, but in education more broadly, I think people are so very focused on what is right in front of them. If you're a teacher, you're focused on your students right in front of you. If you're a school leader, you're focused on your staff and your students. If you're a state leader, you're focused on what's going on in your state. And so I think there is a tendency in education in particular, because it's so important, because it is such a challenging industry, for lack of a better term, that there is often not this sort of pausing of what's right in front of me to be able to stick my head up and kind of look around and to learn from what's happening in another state or in another country or anywhere throughout the world. So I think you're definitely right that there are examples around the world where people have kind of figured out in creative ways how to support young people even in times of a pandemic. But I think the vast majority of people are just not as aware, not as plugged in. And again, it's not to fault them. It is just simply it's an observation of the space that there is such focus on serving the people directly in front of you that it's difficult oftentimes, or you're overwhelmed, so you don't necessarily have the time to say like, well, I wonder what's happening in Indonesia or in Brazil or in Denmark. It's like, no, I got to focus. I'm in Nebraska. I need to focus on what I'm focusing on right here. And so I definitely think that's the case. I think part of what we're doing at EdSpace is we're trying to create the kind of environment where teachers anywhere, anytime, can be able to share what they're doing so that they have it's easier for them to be able to see into a classroom or during a pandemic, perhaps, into their home or on their screen and what they're working with. We're trying to make that easier so that there is this ability for connection in that way. Now, in places where there is not internet connectivity or where they don't have access to laptops or the kinds of software that would allow them to teach in other ways, I think that's a different challenge. And frankly, at EdSpace at this point, it's not a challenge that we've solved at this point. So I think it's an important question. I think the recognition, the observation, the learning that can take place by looking outside of your walls, I think is really powerful. It just, in a pandemic, when teachers have been scrambling to try to figure out how to best serve young people, it's been tough.
Sure. And, if I look at Space and the brilliant work that you do, although it does rely on having a device, having internet access, but I guess a lot of the importance lies in what values you're trying to promote. And it's this whole idea of, social network for teachers, and the fact that you're actually getting teachers to kind of communicate more with each other and sit down and have discussions with each other, whether on formal or personal matters. And that idea in itself, we see it in the form of PLCs, professional learning communities. We see it in the form of, these ad talks that happen on Twitter. So clearly there is a lot of good in terms of these ideas that can also be brought into an offline form.
For sure. Yeah, I think, we, at least at this point, unless we are in the Matrix or we are brains in vats, we still are physical beings. We still, as physical beings, as mammals, as animals, it is the physical part of this is the physical part of our lives is very important. It is important that we can give somebody a hug. It's a different experience when you're physically in a room with people talking about a thing than it is when you're on a Zoom call. It is absolutely important that the kinds of things that we can learn and discover online translate or are transferred into our physical experience, our physical bodies. And so no question, and I think even before the kinds of internet communication technology, the ICT that we're using currently, books, tablets, these are other forms of this sort of thing where you can take, you can convert particular kinds of data and information into learning that can then translate into a physical experience. And so, it's an evolution of that kind of thing. And what we're trying to do, at least at EdSpace, is just expand that kind of access, that kind of connectivity to teachers who right now aren't reaping the benefits because they aren't connecting in those kinds of ways.
Definitely. And if we move from sort of the innovation and the structures in terms of technology and schools, and we look at the people, the learners, the educators, parents, communities. I mean, there has been a lot of talk, a lot of maybe complaints or concerns with regards to how structured the education process is. And there's a lot of talk, a lot of positive talk about how certain countries, Finland, for example, have a lot more freedom and flexibility in their education systems.
Mm-hmm.
So my question to you, Michael, is when we look at things like how standardized exams and how their results lead to university admissions and how getting into a reputable university then lands you a job at a maybe a large multinational organization, and this entire process, I mean, would you say that it stifles collective intelligence? And also this idea of MOOCs, these large online courses, do you think that MOOCs could potentially be the future in bringing about collective intelligence and perhaps replacing standardized exams?
Yeah, good questions. So on the front end around structures, I think one thing that's important to think about is that the absence of structure is not sort of like perfect creativity, right, or perfect innovation. In fact, there are many people who talk about the importance of having constraints, of having structure in place, and within that structure is oftentimes where innovation and creativity can happen. So I think it shouldn't just be this sort of black or white, no, too much, some structure is completely stifling and no structure is completely freeing. In fact, it's somewhere in between. It's somewhere in that gray where we need some kind of structure. There's a great book called Collective Genius, where they talk about different organizations that seemingly have been more innovative than other corporations, big corporations like VW and Pixar and things. And they talk about, as one of the key elements of that, what they describe as rules of engagement. And so it's this sort of, what kinds of constraints are we putting on ourselves? What rules are we playing by? And within those particular rules, how are we then able to kind of use that pressure to innovate at scale, essentially? And so just an example, Jon Stewart, a comedian, former host of The Daily Show, also talks about the importance of kind of having some constraints, having some boundaries around being creative or being funny. And so something to think about. I think the standardization, the university admissions, those kinds of things, the way that we do applications, I don't necessarily, I think it can stifle collective intelligence in that if it is only allowing a particular kind of person or a person who sees the world in a particular kind of way to access these levels, then it shouldn't be surprising that only certain ideas are emerging, essentially. So if we are providing a particular kind of discrimination early on, then the people who make it through that, if they all look or sound or think the same, then the kinds of collaboration that is possible beyond that will be hindered. At the same time, because of technology, because all of us, many people have access to the internet and Google and laptops and all kinds of creative software, I think that it now, probably more than maybe ever, the ability for an individual to kind of carve out their own learning and develop themselves as their own agent of their life is higher now than before. It means that when large challenges emerge or when big companies begin to think differently about who they hire and not just the engineers that score at the top level, but we actually need artists and philosophers and liberal arts majors and engineers and business, so what it means then is that the people who have not gone through a particular track are now developing the kinds of attitudes, behaviors, and skills that will allow them to contribute in new ways. So I think it, in some ways, this sort of university application standardized exams can be stifling, and on the other hand, it's not completely smothering because there are other ways that people are beginning to develop and think differently. Now, in terms of MOOCs, I think MOOCs have advantages. They've been around for a long while. There have been people who have talked about, MOOCs transforming the globe and transforming higher education in particular, and we haven't really seen that bear fruit yet. I think for many people around the world, MOOCs have been an incredible opportunity for learning and connection that hadn't existed before. But for the vast majority of students or learners, it hasn't completely shifted the way that they approach their learning and their work. I'm going to mess this name up. I was listening to a podcast pretty recently with a professor. I'll have to get you the name after this, but a professor at NYU who focuses on higher education and innovation. And he talks about three things that the university provides. A social environment, so sort of socialization of interacting with other, 20-year-olds free of parent involvement. And so there's this sort of socialization effect. The actual learning that takes place at a university through classes, courses, etc., and credentials. When you emerge from these spaces, the university serves as a credentialing body that articulates that, yes, you did the things you needed to do here, and you now have a credential that can be used beyond. And so if we think about what online learning or what MOOCs can do, MOOCs can deliver on some of that learning, probably, although I think the best research shows that it's not necessarily, in person is better than online most of the time. So it can deliver on some of the learning. It can yield a credential, but what it can't completely do is this social aspect, the socialization, the living in a dorm or sitting next to people and interacting in small groups in person kind of thing. So I do think that MOOCs will continue to exist. They will continue to engage people who don't have access to a university in their town or state or city, but it won't completely replace everything, because there are other aspects of the university that we currently value, and that I would argue have value for workers, have value for citizens, for just adult humans moving forward. So I think MOOCs play a part, but I don't think they are the this sort of overwhelming, overtaking force that is coming over the hill.
Certainly, and I think, Michael, with the advent of the pandemic, and who knows what the future lies in terms of global crises, MOOCs, or at least online learning and distance learning, will play an ever increasing role. I mean, we see the likes of Harvard and MIT, announcing that a full academic year's worth of courses will be carried out as fully online learning. So they are amongst the most reputable universities worldwide. So I hope we will end up with some good data as well in terms of how their learners fare from this unique experience.
For sure.
So Michael, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe your PhD is in educational psychology.
That's correct.
And my next two questions will tap into that bit of your expertise. So if we look at collective intelligence, firstly, do you think that collective intelligence in education hinders the anomalies? So those who are unique and may not fit, into the round holes. So these would be the folks that are square pegs. And I think secondly, if we look at human nature, and it's human nature to be social creatures, but how have we ended up in a position where, despite the fact that working across silos actually takes more effort, based on our human instinct, yet it prevails over, being more working across more sociable means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So to the first part of the question, I don't think in general that collective intelligence in education hinders the anomalies. I think, again, the answers to many of these questions are, it depends, or sort of yes and no. I think this is another version of that, but I tend to lean towards one side a little more on this one, in that I don't think it hinders it. And I don't think it hinders geniuses, anomalies, people who sort of see things differently, because what collective intelligence requires are different perspectives. It requires people with different skills. It requires people who see things and see the world differently. And so, in fact, the anomalies need to be incorporated into a collective intelligence framework precisely because of that reason. I think if we weren't interested in working together in these sort of collaborative ways, I think if we were just focused on silos, if there was a genius who didn't fit into any of these silos, they would be kind of out of luck. But in today's world, in the future world, in a world where collective intelligence plays a more prominent role, we need all of us. We need geniuses. We need people who are excellent at executing on a particular thing. We need people who are experts in a particular niche. So it really sort of opens the umbrella, the tent, pick your symbol here. But it requires all of us to bring all of what we have to be able to contribute in this way, because the highest level of collective intelligence, in a sense, is one in which a wide range of assets, attributes, skills are incorporated and sort of merged to yield a collective intelligent response. So I don't think it stifles in that way. And then what you're talking about in terms of social, sort of the fact that we are social beings, and yet oftentimes working across our silos in this sort of social way is more challenging. I think that is definitely the case. I think on the one hand, we are social beings. We can't live independently in the same way that we might think we do. There's this, in the US, there was a term called the rugged individual in politics a number of years ago. There's this whole push towards, I built my own business, like by myself, basically, which is that has never been true. And so I think we at least in the United States, we have this connection to rugged individualism, to an independence, to I am doing this myself. I am an expert in this. I'm going to work in this direction, and that's the best thing. I think we are drawn to that. At the same time, we are social creatures. We do rely on so many things that other people have contributed to. Okay, so there's that. In terms of collective intelligence, though, what it requires is working across silos, working across departments, working across cities and states. I think that can be challenging because I think there are a number of factors. I think we oftentimes want to, for lack of a better term, we're sort of lazy, or we seek efficiency and ease and simplicity, and we don't love to do the hard thing. We know, the best science data that about health tells us about exercise, diet, and sleep. Turns out those things are not easy. They require work. They require additional energy in order to put the cake down and eat the salad, or to go to bed and get 8 hours of sleep instead of staying up and watching Netflix, or even doing something productive and getting 5 hours of sleep, right? So these are some of the things that are best for us at an individual level, require energy, and they're difficult. I think the same kind of thing applies here, where actually working with people across silos, across countries is challenging. It adds extra frustration and strife, but it can yield things that doing them by yourself can't do. So I think there's that. I think, especially in education, we've created many arbitrary lines where we've created these arbitrary lines, and then we stick to them, or we sort of we feel constrained by them, right? So in the US, there are grades, right? If you're born, if you're 6, you could be in first grade, but you could also be in kindergarten. Like, we've created these categories for grades. There are subjects, right? So history is somehow distinct maybe from social studies, which is distinct from civics, right? We've sort of just made these lines. And so I think growing up and being educated in those spaces, we sort of find ourselves in one of these pipelines or one of these silos, and we create distinctions that don't necessarily exist. And so I think part of it is that. And then the other thing that comes to mind here is just, I think at some levels, our own ego or our own status of sort of, I am a great historian. If I start to work with the folks in politics or the social studies teacher, then I might lose some of my kind of status or prestige in my own subject, right? And so I don't know if I want to do that. I'm the #1 history teacher in the state, but if I start collaborating with these other groups, I will kind of lose that, even though something better could come from it. So I think it's tricky, but I think hopefully more so now than ever before, with generations growing up with this kind of internet connectivity, they begin to see themselves and their part in the broader world differently. They begin to see the value and the inevitability of connecting and working with others, so that the kinds of benefits that can come from something like collective intelligence and that kind of collaboration are more likely to happen than, with my generation or older generations that didn't necessarily grow up with that sort of connectivity and collaboration at the forefront.
That's great, Michael. You mentioned some key points. If I may summarize, the need for energy, the need to overcome bad habits, the need to kind of work beyond one's personal ego. And if I may quote from Pierre Levy, who is actually the gentleman who coined the phrase collective intelligence and the concept of collective intelligence, it also takes time. He points out that collective intelligence doesn't emerge spontaneously nor instantaneously. And if I may also add to that, collective intelligence and also the need for collaboration are pretty much two sides of the same coin. So based on the work that you do with EdSpace, this platform being a social network for teachers, do you think that collective intelligence ultimately relies upon individuals or groups of individuals having the necessary social skills? Perhaps, for instance, having empathy towards one another, and also the need for equity in participation. So, ensuring that, for instance, as many teachers as possible have provisions to access the EdSpace platform.
Yeah. So again, like many of these, it's sort of yes and. I think definitely in terms of equity, it is critical. As I mentioned before with the question about geniuses or anomalies, if there are groups of people, if there are populations of people that don't have access to tools and technology and opportunities to be able to add their voice, to be able to add their experience, then the collective is not benefiting from those. Sort of vice versa, there is something powerful about having your voice heard and contributing to something bigger than yourself. And so if you're, a teacher who is in a under-resourced school and you don't necessarily have the technology for that, it means two things. One, it means that you don't have access to a broader community of innovators and passionate teachers. And it also means that all of those folks don't have access to your brilliance and to your genius and to your creativity. And so equity plays a critical piece in collective intelligence for sure, but just in a broader society that we want to try to bring about. So I think that's one thing. In terms of empathy, I think it's yes and no, right? So on the one hand, if you zoom way up, collective intelligence speaks to different groups or kinds of people contributing in different kinds of ways, and in the sort of merging of those benefits, yielding something bigger than any of them could have done by themselves. And so on the one hand, it's not the case that folks working in big data, for example, have to be empathetic towards folks working in hardware development. It's not necessarily the case that because they're not empathetic, there can't be collective intelligence. I don't think that's true. However, if you zoom down within the folks working on data, if you and I are working at Google on a particular project, the project benefits, you and I both benefit, and ultimately collectively the outcome benefits if you and I can work well together. And so in that case, it's very valuable and important for me to have social skills, to understand where you're coming from when you're bringing your ideas and input to the table. So I think empathy works on that sort of micro level. Preferably, empathy extends much beyond just who you're working with or who sits in the next cube or who you jump on a Zoom call with. Preferably, empathy extends to all of us as human beings. But I think for collective intelligence specifically, it's not completely vital. I mean, there's a great book called Big Mind by Jeff Mulgan, and he talks about collective intelligence, and he talks about the need for sort of different contributing factors to what collective intelligence requires. So he talks about being able to observe, being able to analyze, judgment, creativity, all these sort of different aspects. And so I think for people who are experts or who are focused on one aspect of that, for them to be empathetic across the spectrum, it is valuable and wonderful, but not completely necessary for collective intelligence to benefit.
Thank you, Michael. And if I may go back to where we began, we talked about the COVID-19 pandemic and the need for collective intelligence in the search for a vaccine. Do you believe then that the same thing works in education? Is there collective intelligence leading towards certain solutions in education that behave like vaccines that should be prescribed to educators, learners, parents, communities? Or do you think that people should be given a choice with regards to what they choose or choose not to take up?
Yeah, I think so. I lean more towards the latter, and I lean more towards the latter where people have more agency and the ability to choose more about their lives than not. I think the vaccine analogy doesn't completely hold with respect to education because, in generally speaking, our bodies, we are not choosing the ways in which our immune system reacts to particular pathogens in our bodies. Arguably, you can say that you're choosing to not sleep or to not eat or to, not meditate or things that can help your immune system for sure. But in general, the ways that vaccines work, I am not a scientist in this way, but my understanding is the way a vaccine works is that there's a little bit of the disease or virus that's injected. Your body figures out how to defend itself, and so that in the future, when sort of the full virus enters your body has developed the antibodies necessary to fight it off, and all of that is happening outside of your conscious intervention. I think for education, it's different because it is a conscious experience. So in that sense, I guess what I mean is, regardless of whether you think we have free will or not, we think we do, right? And so it is very important for us. It is very important for us, according to us, to be able to choose the things that we do in our life, even if it's the case that scientists or researchers show that everybody needs to do computer science 3 hours a day. If I don't feel that way, if I don't think that that's what's best for me, if I have a child who is refusing that at all costs and wants instead to go play her violin or do gymnastics or build towers, then she shouldn't be forced to do something that she despises. And there's plenty of research that shows that allowing young people and adults actually to have autonomy over the things that they learn, have the ability to develop some competence or some mastery over the things that they learn, and be able to do it with and among other people who appreciate them, who see them. When those three things are present, motivation is maximized, enjoyment is maximized. And so if we can begin to weave more of those aspects into the schooling experience, then I think that's critical. Now, it doesn't mean that researchers and sort of the experts in education, if you will, can't incorporate aspects of that research into the work. It just means that unlike a virus that is or a vaccine that's injected into a body and the body sort of deals with it, when the experts bring education research to teachers, students, parents, schools, it interacts. This is where it gets back to complexity, right? It interacts with the people. It interacts with teachers and staff and students in ways that make it so that these folks need a say in the words that are coming down, essentially. So I would push more for learners, for students, for teachers to have more say over what they're learning, what they're doing, what they're teaching, than just somebody on high saying, these are the top 3 things you need to teach. You need to teach them in this order. You need to deliver them in this particular sequence in this particular time frame, because that's what the research suggests.
Thank you, Michael. If I may surmise, I think it's about a bottoms-up approach rather than top-down, letting the learners, educators, parents even have that level of agency to not just make decisions for themselves, but I think also to influence the collective decision. Maybe have learners come up with, what they would like to see included in their syllabus, for example. After all, they're the ones who are going to learn that syllabus, and they're the ones who are going to benefit from it in the many years to come.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think is, if there's one thing that teachers or school leaders or policymakers can take, it's that when people have ownership or people have control over their lives, and over what they learn, then they learn more, they enjoy it more, they're able to sort of get deeper and further in that learning, which allows for different kinds of connections, which allows for different kinds of new discoveries to emerge. If people are just floating in sort of the shallows, as the author Carr talks about with the internet, if people are just sort of floating in this top shallow space, then the things that emerge from that shallow space are going to be very similar to one another, and they're not going to get at these deeper things that allow us to be human, that allow us to have 7+ billion people on this planet, and hopefully allow us to stay and live on this planet for a lot longer. We need that kind of depth. We need that kind of connection, that kind of collaboration for the future, essentially, to say it sort of bluntly. And a major important way to do that is to allow the people who are the learners, the people who are the growers and the creators, to have some say over what that looks like for them.
Michael, it's been an enriching conversation. And to our audience members, there is once again the EdSpace app. Please use it to ask Michael your questions, provide your comments, your feedback. Of course, also post your reflections. We have covered a lot in the past 1 hour. Share your thoughts with us, share your thoughts with one another, and let's see how this conversation can grow. But in the meantime, if I may close with a few quick questions. So with the advancement of technology, we are gradually seeing, artificial intelligence, machine learning, a lot of all these things creeping ever more into the realm of education, certainly in EdTech. Perhaps you have some predictions in terms of how that will go, Michael. And also, I think aligned to that, what do you see as some of the key takeaway messages, the key strategies that anyone in education, from the bottom to the top of the food chain, can put into action?
Sure. In terms of predictions around where the organic and the artificial meet, there's a handful of people that I am aware of that are doing really cool things in this space. So there's a Professor Neri Oxman at MIT who is merging, who's sort of combining architecture and design with sustainable materials. So sort of buildings or structures out of organic plants, which is fascinating. Somebody like Jeff Mulgan, who's I think now a professor at UCL in London, is focused on sort of the interface between, or the interaction between humans and machines, the sort of organic and artificial and sort of technology. And so I know he is doing important work there. And so this will not, it's not going to slow down. I know that much. I know because of where technology is, and because of its advancement, and because of our need as humans to figure out how to survive and sort of curtail and leverage these technologies, there are people who are working at that intersection and trying to make sure that the technology doesn't get too far ahead of us, or sort of out beyond where we can keep it and sort of use it for our needs. And so just a general prediction is that it's not going to slow down, and that more and more people are going to be into sort of working at that intersection. In terms of key takeaways, just like, I guess a couple come to mind. One is to try to learn widely. And so, if you are in a particular silo, if you are an electrical engineer, or you are working in finance, or you are a science teacher, see what you can do to read or watch TED Talks or explore other spaces that you're less familiar with. I promise you that there will be some nugget or piece of of wisdom, or just even maybe an angle to the work that's being done in some other space that could be relevant for you. And I think that I know has helped me, or I've appreciated that when other people have encouraged me to do that. Share. The second thing would be share what you're doing. Tell people about the things you're reading, about the things that you're building or discovering, or the things that you're wondering. I think with technology now, this ability to we see TikTok and Instagram and people sharing dance videos and, what's their food or whatever it may be. That's fine. That's kind of, base level sort of sharing, but there's other benefits that can come from sharing more in-depth things, sharing the projects that you're working on. And maybe a friend of a friend who works in another industry is really interested in that because they want to bring in some of those ideas to you never really know what can come from that. And so sharing, I think, is a key piece to that. I guess the last one, just more on a personal level, would be to try to take care of yourself. I mentioned before around food and exercise and sleep. I think especially now, especially in a pandemic, when we aren't getting the same kinds of physical interactivity that we did when you could go to a bar, or you could go to an amusement park or the market or something, when we aren't getting those kinds of sort of social rejuvenation in that way, I think it's really important that we do what we can to take care of ourselves. So try to eat a little bit better, try to get outside once a day, try to get close to 7-8 hours of sleep. It will allow you to flourish in whatever industries that you're working in. And even if that's challenging, I think it's worth it.
And finally, Michael, with regards to yourself as well as for EdSpace, where do you see yourself innovating and changing people's mindsets, provoking mindset change within the next 12 months or so?
Yeah. So what we're doing at EdSpace is we are trying to create the kind of environment that would allow teachers, in this case in particular, but ultimately anybody in the education kind of learning space, to begin to connect with one another, and not just for connection's sake, but ultimately to help kind of nourish the individual, and also to empower the individual and the teachers generally to begin to take more control and ownership over their profession, over the craft of working and serving young people. Teachers today they tend to be kind of appreciated from a distance, but not appreciated in terms of the resources they get. They're often blamed for things. They're often overworked, often underpaid. And so what we're trying to do is to create the kind of space where teachers can begin to say, you know what, I do have expertise. You know what, I do have something to offer. I am worth it. I am important. I am essential, to use today's words. And so over the next 12 months, what we're working on are finding and partnering with schools or districts or organizations that want to begin to use EdSpace for their own purposes, for sort of internal professional learning support, as well as trying to drive innovation by connecting with people beyond their school or beyond their organization. And so over the next 12 months, the hope for us is to identify a handful of these partners, begin to learn for ourselves what it means when people are able to engage and connect on EdSpace, ultimately so that we can then kind of distribute that more widely. And then again, beyond, the hope is for people to begin to realize that they have something to offer, that the work that they're doing is super important, and that the profession, the space of education should belong to the people in education. And hopefully through these kinds of connections on EdSpace, people begin to recognize that.
Thank you so much, Michael. A great way to end this conversation. Yourself and the great work that EdSpace does in empowering individuals, I guess. And the same applies for our conference. To audience members, we hope you have been empowered and will continue to be empowered in the coming days. And once again, thank you so much, Michael, co-founder of EdSpace, our official Inspired Community app. Please do download the app if you have not done so. And if you would like to offer your questions, offer your comments, reach out to Michael, please get in touch using the EdSpace app, as well as some of his contact details below this video.
Thanks so much, Nigel. I appreciate it.